The tugboat's bow slid into the sand of the opposite shore. Its motor puttered for the last time and then fell short, water continuing to gurgle astern. So we had made it. The long-awaited left bank. The tugboat's bow slid into the sand of the opposite shore. Its motor puttered for the last time and then fell silent, water continuing to gurgle astern. So we had made it. The long-awaited left bank. A flare flashed overhead. Its bright light sent a reflection across our steel helmets, and we all froze. I cannot describe the feeling we had looking at each other as we waited to be hit with a fusillade. Fortunately, nothing happened. The flare went out, and the shore came back to life by about 5 that morning. Our entire 284th Rifle Division had crossed the river. I still can't understand why the Germans did not fire a single round at us as we crossed the Volga. Perhaps it was because the night was exceptionally murky and we had been careful not to betray our presence with unnecessary sounds or movements. More likely, the Germans simply let their guard down, presuming that the Russian army at Stalingrad was already broken, and that among the city's ruins there only quasi-communists. The Nazis must have believed that all that remained for them to do were a few wipe-up operations, and the Red Army in Stalingrad would be kaput. Anyway, I will never know why or how, but the fact was that our division succeeded in crossing without a single casualty. Now there was no longer any doubt. We would soon enter the battle. The baptism of fire for us sailors was going to commence on dry land, in a devastated city. Who would begin it, and which of us would survive to see to the end? I was resigned to whatever was going to come. I had been repeating to myself that I was not going to retreat. Even if I was staring death in the face, I knew that my comrades from the Pacific Fleet were thinking the same thing. As I turned all this over in my mind, I remembered my days in Vladivostok, and a radio announcer reading out the regular news update from the Sovinform Bureau. Our forces have abandoned Sevastopol. I had heard that discouraging piece of news while I was at the bank, picking up the pay for the month of May, 1942. And there, while standing at the counter behind my back, I heard a condemnation that for me was no less hard to deal with than the announcer's proclamation about Sevastopol. It was preceded by much coughing and hacking from one of the old fogies that worked at the bank. It went like this. So what I'm saying is that any old woman with half a brain can fetch money at the bank. It's time to call up bell-bottom sissies like this one to the front. "You're right about that, Luka Yegorovitch," chimed in the familiar voice of Uncle Fedya, a mechanic who worked in the bank's boiler room. "Take me, for example," continued Fedya. "I hold 2 different positions, so on top of my job here, the upkeep of an entire bathhouse rests on my shoulders. What if the boss were to ask me, Fedya, to hop over to the bank and pick up paychecks for the staff? What's so hard in that? They shouldn't hand these loafers women's work, I tell you. From that moment on, it hurt me to keep serving in a peaceful city, so far from the front. When I returned to the base, I felt ready to toss all the rubles to the breeze, just so that I would be sent to the front with a penal battalion. And that's exactly what would have happened, but precisely at that moment I ran into our base commander, Nikolaev, who informed me that my replacement was arriving and that the fleet command had granted the request of the Komsomoltsi. We were to form a volunteer company of sailors to be sent to the front. I was so stunned I had to catch my breath. The commander grinned at me, pulled out a pack of Belmoras and handed me a cigarette. "I envy you and your Komsomol friend." The commander confessed to me the base commander was a nervous man by nature, who took to heart the most minor snags and screw-ups. He often worked for days with no sleep. He had a scar that crept like a snake from his brow to his cheek, and his worries made it stand out from the worn flesh. "I've put in 4 requests of my own to be sent to the front," he said. "The last time I made a submission, the military council one finally gave me my response." The commander pulled out a copy of the letter, with its official stamp, and showed it to me. It read as follows: "Please explain to Tovarishch Nikolaev that he must understand we are not on a holiday, and that the Pacific Fleet has a mission to accomplish here in Vladivostok. If Tovarishch Nikolaev doesn't come to understand this, the matter will be sorted out at the next staff meeting. If necessary, right up to expulsion from the party and dismissal from command." Nikolaev knew he could not pursue this matter any further. The decision of the military council was final. He was a wise commander who had given 18 years to the service, and at that moment he appeared to me almost like my own father, and in his way disappointed, as my father had been in his military career. My father's wound had sidelined him and kept him from fighting for the revolution during the Civil War. Now, Nikolaev had been sidelined by circumstance and stuck here in Vladivostok when he wanted to be in the thick of things. Commander Nikolaev counseled me on how to comport myself in bat. The most important things were never to lose courage and to always be alert. I was the most senior volunteer and therefore was appointed commander of our detachment of sailors, which was to be part of the Pacific Fleet Naval Infantry Battalion. Time dragged by sluggish. One night I made the special effort to review all of our unit's books. I managed to draw up a complete financial report to hand over to my replacement, and early the next morning I took a walk down to the ocean. Dawn was breaking over the sea with exceptional beauty. It began with the appearance of a barely noticeable point of brilliant light. It was the Zarnitsa, the pathfinder star for the sun. The Zarnitsa is as tiny as a mouse eye, but at dawn it shines so brightly that it lights up everything around it. This little light was no ordinary star. It was more like a scout, laying out a path for the sun to travel. When that little star flared up, the sun soon followed it. On that particular morning, I thought of it as the star of good fortune. As the sun rose, the flowers, the trees, the birds singing, and the peaceful grazing animals, every living thing I saw was rejoicing and turning towards the sun. And, of course, I too was rejoiced. How could it be otherwise, considering what lay in store? Tomorrow I was going to leave to serve my country at the front. After a swim in the chilly ocean, I trotted back to my barracks. By that time everybody knew that a detachment of 20 Komsomoltis, myself included, was heading for action. Time was running out, and they gave us a send-off in the true Pacific Fleet fashion, **. Now we had finally arrived at Stalingrad on the left bank of the Volga. Was the Zarnitsa going to be the same lucky star for us sailors from Vladivostok? He couldn't find it in the sky here over the Volga. The stars of the steppe looked completely different from those over the Pacific. We disembarked from the barges and waited for the order to engage the enemy. Until orders came down, we were to stay put near the moorings. Sailors can normally tell the time by looking at the sky, but in the city it was impossible. The sky was completely blanketed by smoke. We could see that our officers were getting jittery. And this made us even more nervous. It became obvious that we were going into battle at any minute. But where was the enemy? Where was his front line? It seemed like no one wanted to find out. The idea of sending out scouts had not even occurred to our battalion commander, Kapitan Kotov. He was lying on his stomach next to me. To my other side was Starshi, Lieutenant Bolshapov. As the sun rose, the outlines of distant objects in the city's factory district began to take shape. We could see giant petrol tanks to our left. What was behind them, and who was out there? Beyond the tanks was a railway yard, scattered with empty carriages, where God only knows what lay hidden. A few minutes passed, and German scouts spotted us and called down a mortar strike on our position. Then Mi-109s appeared overhead, an incendiation of concussions, each one of which rattled our teeth. Turmoil reigned amongst us. Sailors rushed back and forth, not knowing what to do. Kotov, Bolshapov and I leaped into a deep bomb crater. We were stuck there, glued to the earth, as we waited for the bombardment to slacken off. To all sides, we could hear groans and pleading from our wounded. A messenger leaped in with us. He reported that the Division S, second in command, had been killed. This was horrible. Things couldn't have been any worse. Exactly at that moment we heard the whoosh, whoosh, whoosh of our Katyushas, two firing from the opposite bank. Nice job, boys, and right on time. We could see the Katyushas pulverizing the Fritz's mortar batteries, with Fritz's being blasted into the air as each salvo hit the ground. What a sight this was! The yellow flames of the Katyushas, explosions, then men and pieces of men thrown into the air in every direction. Starshi Lieutenant Bolshapov ran up a rise and raised his pistol. He shouted, "Rodina!" 3. He dashed towards the huge petrol tanks where the Fritz machine gunners had taken up positions. It was as if a spring had shot me to my feet. I don't recall how, but I ended up at his side. I urged my fellow sailors to follow me. Our line, which had been wavering, suddenly pulled back together. Every one of us leaped to our feet. Our fear and hesitation had been eradicated. A united attack can embolden even the most timid. The Fritzes opened up with machine gun fire from our left. The machine gun nests were well camouflaged somewhere in the ruins by the Doldy ravine. Our waves of advancing sailors dropped to the ground, and the attack stalled. Starshi, Lieutenant Bolshapov ordered me to run up to the shattered buildings and take out the machine gun nests with grenades. I obeyed his orders at once without hesitation. Fortunately, the enemy fire flew past me, leaving me unscathed. As soon as the German machine gun fire was halted, our sailors again leaped to the attack. When the Fritzes caught sight of us and realized we were close to outflanking them near the petrol tanks, they called in another artillery strike. They were able to coordinate it with an air strike by the Luftwaffe. The German incendiary bombs lit a huge fire, and the petrol storage tanks began exploding. Everything was showered with burning fuel. Above us was a deafening roar. Another minute, and we would have been turned into so much smoked meat. The soldiers and sailors who were engulfed in flames ripped off their burning clothes. But none of us halted our advance, nor did we drop our weapons. An attack of naked burning men. What the Germans must have thought about us, I can only guess. Perhaps they took us for demons, or maybe saints, that not even flames could stop. This might explain why they abandoned their positions and ran like rabbits without even looking back. We beat them back from the road adjacent to the petrol tanks, and they didn't stop running until they reached the city's westernmost avenues. We took cover among the tiny freestanding houses that lined the street. Somebody threw me a tarp to cover myself. We stood around naked, some with tarps draped over us, waiting until new uniforms were brought up. A bunch of naked Russian soldiers had come through their baptism of fire. Astris Metal, our Ko directed our fire towards Tritargi, the metalworking factory along the Dolgi Ravine, the city's ice house, and Mamayev Hill, which long ago had been a cemetery. In the Dolgi Ravine, we made contact with a machine gun company from Rodimpsev S-13th Guards Division. They had been decimated by fierce fighting at the city centre. German planes continued to circle above. Some Mi-109 Ace were hitting the Krasny Oktyot factory and the northern slopes of Mamayev Hill. They were using incendiary bombs on other targets as well, and in some areas the earth was on fire. The air had been superheated, so that our lips cracked from the scorching temperatures, our mouths went dry, and some men had their hair fused together into a mass no comb could separate. Our battalion commander, Kapitan Kotov, was hasful. The petrol tanks had been taken, and we now occupied a nearby unfinished red brick house. We had captured the metalworking factory's office, and were inside the factory itself fighting for its huge workshop, as well as those of the adjacent asphalt factory. Command gave us a breather. I looked around, and in every direction I could see the city burning around me. Flames were rising over homes, over the metalworking and asphalt factory. I ran my hands over myself. It was a reflex action. I was checking for bullet holes. Above me, a thick black column of smoke was rising high into the air. It moved noiselessly along the shore to the west. Like a black veil, it drew tight around Mamayev Hill and completely obscured the fighting there. The smoky cloud sank ever closer to the earth. The smoke crawled into the ruins of the buildings and into basements underground. It seeped down into the trenches and pushed away the breather be the bear. Rain was drizzling down, and the smoke drifted through the rain and out towards the Volga. German aircraft continued their bombing runs. At first we hid among the roofs, in craters and at the base of stone walls. None of these provided enough protection, so we ran across to the plant's farthest workshop to take cover beneath tables supporting presses and lathes. The bombing and artillery exchanges stopped again, and we were once more on the attack. Hundreds of men locked in mortal struggle. I saw the sailors around me wrestling with the Germans. Suddenly a big German was on top of me. He hit me with the butt of his gun. Fortunately, the blow glanced off my helmet instead of my face. This was where our training on the other side of the river came in handy. I slipped behind him and got my arm locked around his neck, then managed to choke him while he thrashed around trying to shake me off, like a buffalo trying to dislodge a tiger from his back. Finally, the Fritz stopped struggling, and I smelled something foul. He had shit himself at the moment of death. The enemy soldiers melted away, and there was another lull in the fighting. We inspected the ruins of the metalworking factory. Suddenly, I spotted a young girl, very thin, with feeble legs that were scraped and bleeding. She was in a torn blue dress, too big for her, and on her bare feet she wore little red boots that were ripped like her dress. She was walking at the head of a line of our wounded soldiers, leading them through an abandoned ravine toward one of our aid posts. A shell burst nearby, and fragments and clumps of dirt showered the wounded men. Then the Nazis' explosive bullets began whizzing by. The Fritzes were targeting our wounded, but the little girl just kept on leading them, ignoring the danger. I took cover and fired off the entire drum magazine of my submachine gun in the general direction of the fascists. I will remember the courage of that little girl as long as I live. Starship Lieutenant Bolshapov wondered out loud. How did that girl figure out a path through our lines back to the aid posts? What if the Fritzes discovered the path and were able to outflank us from the rear? Bolshapov ordered me to go with Sasha Rutov and find out where the path led, and to see if the fascists would be able to use it to infiltrate our lines. We grabbed our submachine guns and a few grenades each and ducked into the ruins. I was in the lead, with Rutov behind me, lighting our path with his torch. We stumbled through the destruction and ducked beneath the bent girders. We approached a massive steel door, opened it, and were immediately choked by the reek of kerosene, along with some other heavy, unidentifiable stench. Rutov covered his face with his shirt. "Whew," he said, "you could hang an axe 4 on that." There we were in a long, narrow corridor, and to the right was another door. We could hear voices and groans from behind it. Who was there? The enemy, or our guys? We pushed against the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the inside. Rutov put his ear to the keyhole and listened. "It sounds like Russian," he said, and then he pounded on the door. In the closed space, his knock echoed like cannon fire. From somewhere behind the door, a deep voice demanded, "Who's there?" I recognized the voice as one of our fellow sailors, Nikolai, Kolya, Korapi, Kolya, Basia, and Rutov. We waited for what seemed like several minutes. The The ground shook from time to time, reminding us that there was a bombardment going on outside. Finally, we heard the screech of an iron bolt, and the door swung open. In front of us stood a half-naked man. His face and chest were covered with burns. His left arm hung in a cloth that was tied around his neck. This was my Navy buddy Kolya, former laundryman and more recently the bookkeeper on the Poltavshina. He was a loudmouth and joker. There were 19 other men in the cellar. They had already received first aid. Nurse Klavas Fentsova and 2 helpers were taking care of the wounded. But the wounded needed to be immediately evacuated across the Volga to a real hospital. It turned out that from this basement you could reach the Volga by a hidden route, first by a labyrinthine path through some ruins to an area of freestanding houses, then down into the Dolgi ravine. From there the moorings were a stone's throw away. Medical personnel had used this route to get here, but had been disrupted when the Germans took over the plant workshops up above. The Nazis down in this dank and mouldy basement are wounded, a perfectly neighbourly arrangement. Kolya cracked. He had found the spirit to joke, despite his burns, foxes in the hen house. If only we could find a way through for the battalion, to drive out the Fritzes from upstairs so we could move these casualties. Sasha Rutov had found something, and he called me over. I turned to look. It was a large rectangular air duct over 2 yards in width. It was about 5 feet high. I stand 5 feet 3 inches, so I was able to walk through it with only a slight duck of the head. The air inside was clean, breathing was easy, and I could even feel a slight draft. I passed through it into the darkness. With my left hand I held on to a thick braided cable, which was hanging a few inches down from the ceiling. I kept my right hand on the butt of my pistol. The cable made a sharp vertical turn, and within 15 feet I smacked into a brick wall. I fumbled about until I found a short set of wooden stairs. The 4 steps led me up to an exit, a square opening covered by a thick iron sheet. Light was shining through the chinks in the metal. From this vantage point I could hear a firefight immediately above. Machine guns chattering, shells exploding. But exiting this passage, I decided to look around and tried to budge the iron sheet with my shoulder. It was no use. The sheet seemed to have been welded in place. "Sasha," Rutov called from somewhere behind me. "Vasya." He was like a big clumsy bear trying to squeeze himself through this passage. He was panting and out of breath. We both braced our shoulders against the iron cover, and we were preparing to shove it to one side when 2 powerful explosions. Sasha and I looked at each other. Our ears were ringing. We waited, but we didn't hear anything more from above. I muttered, 1, 2, 3, and we pushed up together. The cover budged, but it made a screech that could easily have betrayed us. We had managed to create an opening, but it was so small that only I was able to squeeze through. The bear-like Rutov was several sizes too large to follow, so I poked my head up like a mole and glanced back and forth. All around me were shelves filled with appliances and tooling. I could also see what was going on in one of the adjacent assembly workshops. It was full of Germans, maybe a whole company they had gathered for lump. They had their mess tins and thermoses in their hands. A cook from a field kitchen had delivered a pot of stew for them, and the cook was ladling it out. The Germans were acting relaxed as if they were back in a mess hall in Munich or Cologne. They were oblivious to me, the Russian sailor who was counting them one by one like sheep. I made a rough drawing of their positions, their firing points, the windows, and the Fritz's possible routes of escape. I gave the diagram to Rutov and told him to run back to report to Bolshapov, while I remained to keep an eye on things. A little slip of paper fluttered into my hand. It read, "Muss in Russian." The reverse had some writing in German I could understand. Later I had it translated. It read, "To all soldiers of the Feiger, disarm without delay and send to a power camp all Russian soldiers and officers bearing this ticket of surrender." For the next 20 minutes I watched the Nazis eat their lunch. I counted 65 of them. After they finished, I heard the click of lighters as they broke out their cigarettes for a smoke. 2 of the Fritzes wandered into my corner of the workshop, and I popped my head down. They were so close I could smell the cabbage stew on their breath. I was sure they would notice the bent metal cover, but fortunately they ignored it, as they were laughing at some private joke. I stole a look at them. They were tall and hearty, their faces full of arrogance, the arrogance of the conqueror. Where the hell was Rutov? Here we had the Nazis with their trousers down, and Rutov had disappeared. I had no idea if he had got the message through to our company or not. I imagined that his fat behind had been caught in an air duct, and that he was still stuck there. As I was thinking this, there was a clattering noise from the opposite side of the building, and the Germans began shouting and rushing about. Then I understood that this clattering was intentioned storeroom via the adjacent basement, and they were waiting for the Germans to be distracted by the noises they made. Then I heard Bolshapov's voice shout a command, and grenades were heaved into the Nazi makeshift cafeteria. I counted 30-odd explosions in the space of a few seconds. The 2 Fritzes by me took cover, and I rolled a grenade up to their toes. When they noticed the grenade rolling across the floor, they glanced in my direction and our eyes met. Now that they had seen the grenade coming, they didn't look so arrogant anymore. I ducked and heard them scream as my grenade exploded, then heard ricochets as streams of machine gun fire tore up and down the room. In less than 2 minutes, not a single Fritz in the workshop remained breathing. That evening, we finished mopping up the remaining German positions in our section of the factory. The Germans still held the asphalt factory, the northwest section of the metalworking factory, the transformer room, and a part of the boiler room. In addition, they continued to hold the bridge and a railway embankment that skirted the northern edge of Mamayev Hill. We cleaned ourselves up and carried the wounded out of the cellar, then helped to prepare a field hospital for Nurse Klaba Spintsova. Then we sent the wounded back to the docks at the Volga. Thus ended my first battle, or more precisely, my first day of battle, in Stalingrad.